Geography, from human geography, from quantitative geography, also from sociology. So I was the principal researcher for that project, and I was responsible for fieldwork in China, which is one of the top petrochemical polluters in the world. So my research focused primarily on the ways Chinese people make sense of petrochemical pollution and their management of environmental injustice in their everyday. So in China, many refineries and petrochemical plants, they are very close to residential areas. Sometimes they are just adjacent to residential areas. But despite the close proximity to people's homes, residents appear to be rather indifferent to the threat of toxic pollutions and chemical explosions, even though they are aware of the danger they are exposed to. So let me try to demonstrate this through two vignettes. The first one is we had to hire a driver to drive us to the petrochemical plants because it was impossible to actually get to these places with public transport. So one day when my driver was driving me to the petrochemical plant, I tried to take a few photos of the industrial landscape, so something like that, from the passenger seats. And when he saw it, he asked me, "What are you shooting? What kind of picture are you trying to take?" And I said, "Well, I'm trying to take some photos of the petrochemical plants." "The petrochemical plants? What's special about them?" he asked casually. And I said to him, "Well, don't you think the petrochemical structure is pretty striking? The refineries, the oil tankers, the chimneys, they're right in front of you. You can't not notice them, can you?" And to my surprise, he said to me, "No, I don't notice them. They're always here. They have been here before me." And the next afternoon, when I head out for another day of fieldwork, I passed by a building that was undergoing renovation. And although I was standing at a distance, the smell of formaldehyde was so pungent that I felt a burning sensations in my nose, in my eyes, and in my tongue. So there was literally tears in my eyes. I should have left immediately, but I was captivated by the scene of a renovation worker taking a nap on one of the dusty worktops. His shirt was covered with paint, and he wore no safety helmets, no protective clothing, no face mask. He did not seem to be bothered by the formaldehyde smell at all. So immediately, this scene brought me back to the moments when my driver said, "I don't notice them." So it was examples like this in the field that motivated me to find out how people like my driver and also like this renovation worker learned to unnotice things, especially in the context of environmental pollution. Now, in recent years, the chemical turn in anthropology has introduced chemicals into ethnographic imaginary. Traditionally, what we call chemoethnography focuses on disasters of late industrialism. But more recently, however, there has been calls for switching our attentions from things that are falling apart to things that continue to survive. And indeed, there has been a growing interest in the outer lives, lives that are irreversibly altered by the petrochemical world orders. And instead of focusing on the abnormality of late industrialism or doing damage-based research, Michelle Murphy argues that we should look beyond the obvious damage in order to fully understand the less obvious chemical relations and the slow violence that toxicity brought to us. And to this end, anthropologists have been expanding their toolkits and acquiring new skills to study the outer lives of people in late industrialism. And these new toolkits and skills range from chemical sensors to mapping devices to generative design practice and civic technoscience initiatives, all of which seek to unravel the emerging chemiosociality. One technique that has received little attention is how ethnographers train their eyes to notice, conceive, creative and life-affirming work, despite the precariousness of life. In her acclaimed book, Mushroom at the End of the World, anthropologist Anna Sings shows how anthropologists could achieve this by paying attention to different world-making projects within the blast landscapes, a skill that she calls the art of noticing. So in tracing the ecological and commercial legacy of the mastocytic mushrooms, Sink argues that ruins and human-disturbed landscapes of late industrialisms are actually ideal spaces for practicing the art of noticing. She is optimistic that through the art of noticing, ethnographers will discover stories not only of death and destructions, but also survival and flourishing. However, when I brought this methodological tool with me to the field, I was astonished to discover that many Chinese people actually negotiate life in damaged environments by doing exactly the opposite of what I did as an ethnographer. While I exercised the art of noticing to uncover how people live with precarity, my interlocutors lived with precarity by means of unnoticing. So this is how I came up with the art of unnoticing, a concept that I concoct to refer to how people justify living in certain environments and living with certain adversities. Unnoticing, as I conceived it, involves not only one's bodily attunement to the chemiospheres, the chemical and environment, but also a contrived form of ignorance through which people's self-survival is contingent on the maintaining of selective understanding of their own efficiencies and liabilities. Now, although Anna Singh's noticing and my unnoticing emanate from distinct ethnographic contexts, and they serve different purposes, they actually intersect in real-life ethnographic practices, making them good concepts to think with, both within and beyond anthropology. I think the anthropologists in this room will agree with me that anthropologists are good at taking notice. And not only that, they are accurately aware of the ways sociocultural and environmental factors influence how people pay attention and what they pay attention to. As Tim Ingold points out, attention is not simply developed through instructions, observation, and imitations, but also embodied experience and practical activity with one's own environment. Similarly, when people fail to notice something, we need to know that it is not necessarily a result of distraction or absent-mindedness. Like paying attention, the things that people ignore and how they ignore them are also socially and environmentally mediated. Now, while risk perception is inherently a subjective matter, and the variations in opinions is actually not uncommon when the pollution in question is barely perceptible to our senses. But there is a difference between not noticing something as intangible as PM 2.5 and not noticing the smell of the formaldehyde or the sight of the petrochemical infrastructure, which excelled human senses. Of course, people may become oblivious to them if their senses of smell have been numbed by prolonged exposure, or when the petrochemical facilities have slowly blended into the town's landscape after years of operations. However, such obliviousness is by no means natural. Just like learning to become sensitive to one's environment or the environmental change, becoming unaffected too requires work. Now, although the Art of Unnoticing is inspired by Anderson's The Art of Noticing, the theorization of unnoticing is deeply rooted in the historical and social studies of ignorance. So, for example, it is influenced by the concept of ethnotology, which was first coined by linguist Ian Ball and later redefined by historians Robert Porter and Londa Schebinger, who paved the ways for studying the historicity and also the artifactuality of ignorance. In my own disciplines, however, there has been a marked absence of theoretical attentions to the valued and the practical uses of ignorance in economic and social life until very recently. This is probably because anthropologists have always prided themselves on defending indigenous epistemologies and local practice, and we tend to see our informants as the experts in the field, and we are there to document what they know rather than what they don't know. One unintended consequence of that is that it makes ignorance an unlikely ethnographic object. However, I would argue that no theory of knowledge is complete until the complex phenomenon of ignorance is taken seriously. And this is because ignorance is not only a vehicle to reveal the proper working of knowledge, it is also a location for understanding the workings of power. And indeed, both anthropologists and sociologists have demonstrated that under certain circumstances, ignorance is neither the absence or the inverse of knowledge. Rather, it is a concerted effort, one that is produced and sustained by people, usually in the positions of power, but also, as I show in this ethnography, for people who are subject to those power as a way to cope, to deceive others, to avoid conflicts, to preserve peaceful relationships, and to maintain the status quo. So therefore, to understand the socio-cultural productions of ignorance, one will have to investigate not just the gaps in the knowledge, which is where most existing studies of ignorance have concentrated their efforts, but rather the productions of culturally recognized mode of ignorance. Now, contrived ignorance takes many forms. As both Vancipant and Pelkmans point out, contrived ignorance must be understood as a spectrum, like this one, instead of a typology. So if you understand it as a spectrum, contrived ignorance will range from something that's have deliberation on the one end and internalization on the other. So in acknowledging that both conscious and unconscious forms of ignorance are in play in the context of petrochemical risk perceptions, I developed the notions of unnoticing to capture not only the more calculated and strategic form of ignorance, but also the tensions between its more naturalized and embodied forms. In other words, I hope that this concept will eliminate moments when people decide that they ought to ignore something, but I do not disregard the dynamics and the shifting between noticing, habitual not noticing, and unnoticing. So for example, although the vignettes that I used to open this talk, the driver and the renovation worker, they both seem to have normalized the petrochemical sphere as part of their natural environments. Most people in these communities are very much aware of what is going on. And this is evidenced by the fact that whenever a stench struck the residents in the neighborhood, they almost immediately resumed talking about petrochemical pollution. This suggests that they were not completely desensitized. Their senses were not completely desensitized. It's just that they unnoticed it. In many instances, people would deny that there was any pollution, but later concede that their judgment might not be accurate. They were conscious that their own perceptions might be biased because their bodies have become too used to living with pollution. So this is some evidence that strategic deployment of ignorance are nested within the more habitual and the willful form of ignorance. So how did people in this southern city of China lived with petrochemical pollutions through the art of unnoticing? So in 2018, I carried out ethnographic fieldwork among the petrochemical communities in the Huangpu district of Guangzhou. The closest community to the petrochemical plants consists of 3 villages that lie between the plant's petrochemical area and the refinery area. The 3 villages that I call the Old Village, the New Village, and the Happy Valley exist long before the government acquired the land to build the petrochemical facilities in 1973. Even though the petrochemical plant was very close to people's homes, those who lived nearest to it were not the most outspoken critique of the company or the pollution it produced. The irony, it seems, is that the farther away people live from the petrochemical site, the more they notice the petrochemical industry. In Huangpu district, petrochemical pollution is visible but unseen, felt yet ignored. When the villagers and urban residents said they didn't notice, they meant that they had noticed, but they chose to unnotice it. The moral geography of proximity explains not only people's apparent indifference to the health risks of chemical exposures, but also their bewilderment of the ethnographers' enthusiasms of what Shapiro's called chemical sublime, which to them is more like chemical mundane. As for me, because I did not have to live with the effects of the petrochemical industry in the everyday, and this gave me the privilege to notice things that were supposed to go unnoticed. So if petrochemical pollution is meant to be tolerated, how do people justify it through the art of unnoticing? So in this research, I've actually identified 3 common arts of unnoticing that are particular but by no means unique to my field sites in China. The first one is practicing slow observation. In China, many people, especially those with least resources in the country, have resorted to using their own bodies to assess the severity of pollution. Their bodies have become the most readily available environmental monitors. This has led many residents of the village I visit to regard longevity as evidence that petrochemical pollution is not as harmful as most people claim. Now here is a quote from one of the older residents in the village. She said, "I've lived next to the petrochemical plant for 3 decades already. What's the point of worrying now? Many people in our village live till their 90s. My mother-in-law died at the age of 89. My father-in-law died at the age of 92. There is even a nursing home nearby called the Village of Longevity." So the good health and the long lives of the elderly were considered powerful testimonies to the innocuous nature of the chemical mundane in these 3 villages. The Chinese villagers deduced this by practicing slow observations, which is a concept coined by my colleague Tom Davis when he was doing fieldwork in the Cancer Alley in Louisiana, which was one of the most environmentally contaminated regions in the United States. But unlike people living in the Cancer Alley, who use slow observation to perceive the slow violence of sustained environmental brutality, the villagers in Huangpu did not attribute the changing environment to toxic contaminations. Rather, they used slow observation to convince themselves that the people and the crops were strong enough to survive the pollution in this area. For them, it is actually a sign of resilience. Now, without an obvious health crisis, the villagers rarely attribute their mild symptoms, such as coughing or runny nose, to petrochemical pollutions. From the layperson's perspective, such link only makes sense when they resonate with their moral parameters and their everyday experience. As a technique of unnoticing, slow observation may seem like an oxymoron, but as my example shows, the villagers' dismissal of petrochemical pollution result not from failing to notice, but paradoxically from the culmination of years of slow observation. The second strategy is accepting fate, or assenting to fate. Now, fatalism is a recurring theme in many studies of toxic pollution around the world. Among the villagers and the urban residents in Huangpu, the concept of fate also played a central role in their understanding of their own circumstances, especially why they end up living in a petrochemical community. When I asked my interlocutors if they were worried about pollution from the petrochemical plant, oftentimes they would say, "There's no point worrying. No one in China can escape pollution." Now, although this sounds fatalistic, their frustration should not be interpreted as a simple expression of fatalism, by which I mean the attitude of accepting the inevitable with a feeling of powerlessness. While people accepted that environmental pollution is a national burden shared by everyone in the country, the inequality of that burden, that is, why one person ends up living in the district that bears more petrochemical risk, was considered a matter of personal fate. So, for example, one interviewee told me, "If you are capable, you can move on to something better." She said, "You will leave this area. Those who are still in the area is because they are either incapable or lazy." So according to this reasoning, the Chinese idea of fate must be understood in conjunction with the notions of capability. And in Chinese, that's 能力 or 本事. To an extent, this way of thinking reflects the post-socialist milieu in China, in which people's understanding of environmental health risk and their tactics of coping with these risks has been largely individualized since the market reform in the 1980s. Not only are people left to cope with pollution as individuals rather than a community fought by environmental injustice, they are also made to feel inadequate because they cannot escape their predicament. So consequently, it makes sense for these people to accept their fate than to dwell onto the larger structural issues that are beyond their control. In ascending to fate, they learned to unnotice the collective frustrations and carry on with their living. They have also learned to compromise. So here's another quote from a retired worker from the petrochemical plant. He said, "Yes, sometimes there's chemical smell, but nothing is perfect in this world. The thing is, the living environment here is not bad. We are all very used to living in this community. And life is like that. You gain some, you lose some." So in his perspective, by accepting that life is full of compromise. The so-called incapable or the less capable accepted their limitations and rationalized why they could not have it all. For these people, ascending to fate does not mean accepting the inevitable with reluctance and pessimism. It is not a sign of powerlessness. Rather, it is an art of noticing the trade-off and unnoticing the uncontrollable. Because giving in to the force of life was actually liberating, as it resulted in a new kind of agency after you accepted it. The final strategy of unnoticing is engaging in complicity. Now, the idea that life is a series of trade-offs was embraced not only by the so-called incapable class, but also by the middle-class people who were deemed capable due to their home ownership. For those with a stake in the real estate market, pollution has become the empire's new clothes. When I asked Auntie Wang if she was worried about the health effects of petrochemical pollution, she was infuriated. She said, "So what? You get used to it. Petrochemical pollution affects the whole of Huangpu, not just this apartment complex. It's not like we live right next to the petrochemical plant. When you smell it, you just close the window. It's as simple as that. If you're so worried, leave the city and be a hermit in the mountain. I'm 70 years old. You think I would care about this kind of thing?" Like it or not, people are still buying and renting here. So buying a home in a city like Guangzhou is likely to be the greatest financial transactions a Chinese urban dwellers will ever make. It makes little sense for these people to complain after having made the financial and emotional investments of their lifetime. What was at stake was the prestige of home ownership, the market values of their home, and the immediate environments of their private paradise. These shared sentiments formed what Hans de Müller calls a community of complicity. By focusing instead on their own gated community, homeowners in Huangpu were complicit in unnoticing the pollution in the commons. And in this sense, home ownerships, like fate, serve as a prop of the status quo. So when people talk about the elephant in the room, what they often talk about are silences, denials, conspiracies, or open secrets. But in this research, I approached the elephant in the room with a more neutral neologism, the art of unnoticing, by which I mean the contrived form of ignorance that people, especially people with a lot of power, employ to justify living in certain environments and living with certain adversities. Instead of focusing or fixating on the darker side of unnoticing, which tend to see ignorance as the absence of knowledge, and therefore to reduce it to a purely negative phenomenon bearing no values of its own, I use the art of unnoticing to shed light on the techniques that enable people who live near the petrochemical plants to continue living with the reality of pollution while reclaiming some of their agencies in face of the inevitable. What I hope this research would do is to move away from the mainstream narrative that agency entails overt actions. In contrast, I eliminate the significance of deliberate inactions and assertive non-doing in the making of that agency. What I have dubbed the art of unnoticing is by no means a phenomenon found only among the Chinese people or people living with environmental pollutions. I hope that as a concept, it can be used to understand a variety of contexts in the risk society. And finally, the concept of unnoticing, I'm sure you are already thinking about it, is that it has significant implications for future research on environmental justice. I remember on the last night of my fieldwork, I had a long chat with one of my key interlocutors, R1. She told me that, during the conversation, she told me that she had never heard of the phrase 环境公益, the Chinese translation of environmental justice. Before that, I already knew that the concept had yet to become popular in China. And of course, this doesn't mean that the Chinese people lack a sense of justice. The key question is not why the concept of environmental justice is not more prevalent in China, but how to approach environmental justice when there are tensions between local understanding of fairness and deservingness on the one hand, and the normative discourse of environmental justice on the other. When the global environmental justice movement focused primarily on tackling the unequal social and geographical distribution of environmental burdens, what do we do when people deliberately unnotice the inequality that affects them just so they can carry on with their lives, and with such sophisticated justifications? In Huangpu, the symbolic violence and the accumulated injuries of toxic pollution highlight the inadequacy of focusing only on the normative discourses of justice. It forces us to rethink what kind of environmental justice movement is possible for those who feel that they don't deserve living in a better environment. I do not have the answers for it, but I hope that this research has indicated a new path in the study of environmental justice, from the focus of collective activism, more like street protests, to a more nuanced analysis of the process through which symbolic violence, complicity, and fatalistic thinking are developed, justified, and sustained, and what this means for environmental justice. Finally, as an ethnographic practice, taking unnoticing seriously entails a complementary art of noticing, one that pays attention to more than what captivates the ethnographers. So I went into the field with questions about environmental justice and left the field in contemplations of fate and complicity. I have never managed to unnotice the ghastly refinery in Huangpu the way that my driver did, but I have since learned to notice things that people unnotice in their life worlds. So thank you very much. I welcome questions.